Here. I'm thankful you're here. Would love for you to fill out the Connect card, but you can just dismiss what I'm about to say. If you're a member here, I'd like to talk to you. Sometimes as pastors, pastors are people, and sometimes they have bad days too. And I've been in a lot of prayer recently, and I have been convinced that Satan is not happy with what is happening here at our church. This past Thursday night, there were over 28 volunteers from our church who served in some form or fashion at the high school football game. That is something to be happy about. That is something to be excited about. God's doing a lot of great things here. A lot of people are doing a lot of great things. But I've also been struggling really for 6 months about complacency. And I think our church has gotten to a point where we are somewhat complacent. We're doing a lot of ministry. We're making a lot of impacts. We're reaching a lot of people. But in a lot of cases, not every case, in a lot of cases, it's most of the same people who are doing that ministry work. About the same 40 to 50 that are doing the ministry, the work of the church. And we really need to step up in some areas. And for the first, I've been here almost 6 years, and for the first time, we have a lot of areas in our church where we need some ministry help. And one thing I've noticed as pastor, and we had a meeting earlier this week, is we are suffering with a problem, and it is the problem of a lack of commitment. It's the lack of commitment in attendance. It's a lack in a commitment of serving. It's a lack of commitment in giving. And I think you could argue a lack of commitment in prayer. And I think we're struggling in those areas, and I think this week we have a great opportunity to be revived, to be renewed. And I know for me, I need it. You say, why do you need it? I'm pastorally tired. I read a church sign the other week. By the way, I love to hear that sweet baby cry. You are just fine. That doesn't bother me at all, or anybody else. I saw a church sign a few weeks ago, because Lord willing, they'll hear my baby cry here soon. I saw a church sign a few weeks ago that said, your commitment as a member should match what you expect your pastor's commitment to be. And that varies from person to person. But sometimes I get pastorally tired because I'm asking people to do things. Sometimes I feel bad because I'm asking the same people to do things because I can't find anybody else to step up. And then at the end of the day, a lot of it falls on Hannah and I, and we end up doing a ton. And we're not going to be able to do all that once the baby comes. We really need to step up in some areas. And so I'm pastorally tired in the sense of having to beg people to serve a God they say they love. Shouldn't we want to serve the Lord? Shouldn't we want to do these things? I have several positions. If you're interested in any of these, please send me a text. We have 4 teaching positions that are open in our church. We need an assistant teacher from the 1st through 3rd grade. We need an assistant teacher for the 4th through 6th grade. We need a teacher in the kindergarten class, and we need a co-teacher in the senior adult ladies class. 4 positions that we need. Now, those are like dire, all right? Those are important. We also need a church clerk. And so if you're interested in any of those positions, please let me know. As far as many of you know Jim Thomas, he's not going to serve as Sunday school director. He's done a great job for many years. We're not going to necessarily fill that. Myself and Rhonda and Alan are going to kind of oversee that. Small groups kind of takes care of itself at this point for the most part, not always. And so we're going to work with that. And when God allows our children's minister to come, he or she will have part of that responsibility as well. But here's the thing. If we want God to do all the things that we say that we want him to do, we got to be committed. And that was our word of the year several years ago, but we might just have to repeat it. Because I'll just be real frank. I've been brokenhearted a few times the last few weeks. Just feeling like I'm having to do everything. And I know that's not the case, but sometimes it feels like that. You know what I mean? And having to beg people to step up. Let's serve the Lord with gladness. Let's serve Him with our whole heart. Let's give everything we have to Him. I just had to get that off my chest. Thank you. If you have a copy of God's Word, go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. We're going to look at verses 15 through 18. And no, the sky is not falling. And no, our church isn't going to stop ministering to people, because I did tell you we have a huge ministry impact, which is very true. Very true. At the football game the other night, I don't know about the 27 other people, but I personally got to minister to 2 individuals. That was really awesome. And got to have some gospel conversations. I'm sure some others did too. All right, we're in a series in Corinthians, and so we practice verse-by-verse preaching here. And 2 Sundays ago, we looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 1 through 14. And we looked at an interesting sermon called The Money in the Ministry. And this morning, we're kind of looking at the opposite of that in a really interesting way. Now, this morning, looking at verses 15 through 18, we're going to look at the mayhem with money in the ministry. So, several weeks ago, we talked about how it's okay for pastors to be financially compensated for their work. We looked at the office, the outward living, the oxen and the law, and our Lord's teaching. This morning, I want to talk to you, if you're taking notes, on the mayhem with money in the ministry. Because anytime money is involved, mayhem is possible. Anytime people are involved, mayhem is possible. When we look at the potential mayhem that can come with money in the ministry, we need to look at the reality of some preachers, the reward of the God-called preacher, the responsibility of the God-called preacher, and the result of Paul's pastoral ministry. It is no secret that we live in a world that is focused on what one can get. This is a me society motivated by gimme, gimme, gimme. Everybody wants to take. Everybody wants something. And sadly, this is not just infiltrated church culture. It's infiltrated behind the pulpit. In reality, there is nothing new under the sun, but it is becoming too common even in the modern church. This morning, we're going to see the Apostle Paul explain that he has the right to not take that support. He previously argued in verses 1 through 14 that he had the right to be paid, and now he's going to say, you know what, I have the right to also not take it. Why would Paul create that argument just to say in verses 15 through 18, church at Corinth, I don't want your money? We're going to look at it this morning, but Paul wants to remove all doubt. He does not want the Corinthians to have any hint or idea that he is making this argument so that the Corinthians will give him financial compensation. That's not why he's doing this. While Paul does not accept compensation for the church at Corinth, he does accept it from other churches, including the church at Macedonia. You can see Philippians 4, 15 through 18, and 2 Corinthians 11, 9. He did take compensation from other churches, but he doesn't want to take it from the Corinthians. I'll give you a long story short. He doesn't want to deal with their drama. He doesn't want to take money from the Corinthians because he is going to try to show them. He is trying to lead by example, and we'll get to that in a moment. But he's also like, you know what? If I take their money, these people have sent me some nasty letters. I just don't want to deal with them anymore. So I'm just going to preach the gospel free of charge, so that's one less thing they can get upset about, is essentially what Paul, I think, is thinking. But I also think he's thinking about something else. If you go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 13, I think at the front of Paul's mind when he's writing this is that he doesn't want to become a stumbling block. And that goes all the way back to verse 13, to the church at Corinth. This could have hindered them from hearing and heeding Paul's words as he preached the gospel. For other churches that Paul did receive support from, it was not a hindrance to them, but a blessing to them. It was a blessing for them to give to Paul. But Paul realizes that the church at Corinth is different. And as we discussed 2 Sundays ago, the church should financially compensate the pastor, and according to 1 Timothy 5:17, with double honor. But there's always another angle to look at things. And I think Paul hits on one as he also explains why he doesn't want the Corinthians to compensate him. We need to understand some context in Paul's day, though. In the Greek and Roman culture of this time period, there were people who had jobs that we would call professional orators. And they would travel from town to town, and they would give fancy speeches, and they would give fancy poems, and they were professional speakers and comedians, and they would wow people with their voice and their gift of speaking. And they would charge large amounts to do so and to speak until they finally got the reputation of being swindlers, right? Of talking and then getting the money and then leaving, all of these different things. And so that was a known occupation. And let's remember, a lot of these Corinthians are young believers. A lot of these Corinthians are what we would call immature believers, right? And so they could easily look at Paul and say, well, you're just one of those professional orators. If we pay you, you're like one of those professional orators just trying to get a check and then leave. And so Paul knows that that could be a hindrance to them. And so while he makes the argument in verses 1 through 14 that it is okay to compensate pastors, Paul doesn't want to receive compensation from them. And he says, I have that right. Because there is the potential for mayhem when it comes to money. Just like there could be potential for mayhem in any job, home, organization, or business. But historically, Satan has done some of his best work in the local church with money. While Paul is not advocating for overpaying in the ministry, we need to know that it does happen. And it's not good. In this passage, Paul explains why he is not taking compensation, and in doing so, I believe makes a clear defense as to why pastors shouldn't take financial advantage of God's money. What do I mean? While being in the ministry is a vocation, it is not one to be entered with the only idea of making money. You do not get into ministry for money. Now, sure, we've got to eat and we got to have clothes and all that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that's not why you do it. But in society today, there are some quote-unquote pastors that ride around in private jets, drive cars that cost more than my house, and wear designer suits. I did a funeral one time. I ain't going to tell you who or where, none of that. I did a funeral one time, and I was getting ready to walk out, and I was doing it with a pastor, another pastor. He had this really nice suit, and I just kind of felt less than, you know what I mean? Even though I think I have nice suits, this guy's had designer suits. And he asked me, he said, where did you get your suit? And I told him, and then he told me where he got his, and he stuck his nose at me. And I went, oh, okay. And then he pulled out his Bible, and it was goatskin leather. I was like, well, that's great. Mine's about to fall apart, but it works. And so there's a point at times where money can become the preacher's God instead of the God of the Bible. And that happens. And so Jesus said something about this that applies to everybody in the room, but specifically with what Paul's talking about in regards to pastors. Matthew 6:24, you remember Jesus' words. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And there are modern day examples of mayhem in ministry with money and what we would call prosperity preachers, right? And I'm not going to name names, but if you have a copy of my notes, you can see 3 names I put on there of examples. But there are widespread examples. That's not why you should get into ministry. I'm not saying pastors should be poor. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm also saying that they should not be some of the richest people in their community. Question I want to ask you, just as we saw previously, that it is biblically permissible for pastors to be paid, what is the opposite extreme of this, and what mayhem could cause if it's abused? Well, look at verse 15. First, I think you see the reality of some preachers. Look at verse 15. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any provision, for I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. Paul is emotional. He's a very emotional person. He's a very expressive person. And so he uses euphemisms like this that are kind of extreme in order to get his point across. But he's dealing with a group of people who just don't seem to get it. That reminds me of myself sometimes. I love my wife, and we've been trying to get ready for Palmer. And when we were on our mission trip to New York, it was revealed to me that there's a skill I need to work on. It's called reading the room. Some of you might remember that from our mission trip, sharing time. But I won't go into that story. But as we've been getting ready for the baby, I'm trying to read the room. Even though it's just two of us, I'm still trying to read it. You say, well, how are you trying to read it? Well, if there's a box that is at the bottom of the stairs, I figured out that it's supposed to go upstairs. Little things. I'm trying to gain some ground. I don't remember what that had to do with this, but anyway. Paul says, I've made no use of any of these rights. While Paul chooses not to use the rights that he argued for in verses 1 through 14, he writes them to make clear that he does not want the Corinthians to be able to accuse him of taking advantage of them, right? And so the reality of the Apostle Paul's conviction on this matter was not to be a stumbling block. The reality, though, of some preachers today is that they would rather take advantage of the churches they serve financially than try to not be a stumbling block. For example, if I were to ride from Gaston to Swansea in a private jet, that would be a problem. If I lived in a mansion the size of Gaston, that would be a problem, right? That could be a stumbling block. And so while I got to eat and I got to have clothes and I got to provide for my family, that's all fine and dandy. I also don't want to be a stumbling block. But sadly, those examples do occur. And they occur a lot more than you think. Now, I think it's important to know that Paul is writing with great emotion. But look what he said back in 1 Corinthians 9:12. Go back to verse 12. He says, if others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more. He uses the pronoun we. And now, beginning in verse 15, he will no longer use the first person plural, but only the first person singular. Why is that important? This is important because not taking financial compensation from the church at Corinth was a personal conviction that Paul had. He uses the singular pronoun in verses 15 through 18 to show that this was his decision. So he's not saying everybody has to do what he's doing. He's just saying, this is what I'm doing. I'm reminded maybe this day will come, maybe it won't. That's up to the Lord. But maybe one day I might get old and quote unquote retire and come across a church that really needs some help but they can't pay. Well, guess what? Hopefully, I don't think Social Security will exist by then, but hopefully I'll have some retirement, right? And so hopefully I'll be able to help them. And that will be my right to not take compensation from them. And so Paul is not doing that. This is important because not taking financial compensation from the church at Corinth was a personal conviction that he had. He is not saying that everyone had to do this, but he's explaining why he did it. Several churches in our association, I have helped them with pastor search teams. I've helped them with nominating teams. I've helped them with drama, all kind of weird stuff. I don't charge them. I don't say, give me this and I'll fix your problem. I'm not a consultant. I'm a brother at another church. Just trying to help other churches. Not saying ours is perfect or that I'm perfect. That's not the case. But if another church reaches out to me and asks me for help, I'm not going to say, here's my fee. Because that's not what I'm in it for. But you take care of me so that I can do that for others. I had a text this morning from another church. They had a quote-unquote crisis, so to speak. And I was able to, help them. I hope it worked out with what they're dealing with. But the Corinthians did not want to miss out, if you'll remember, on eating the foods that they wanted to from the pagan temple. You remember that whole conversation in chapter 8? Paul, on the other hand, would rather die than preach the gospel and take compensation. So I got to ask you this. Are we willing for our selfish passions and desires to die at the foot of the cross? Are we willing to not do certain things, even if they aren't a sin per se, in order to not cause others to stumble? The reality Paul had was that he was denying these rights. The reality that some preachers have is they want to take from God's church and not necessarily give back to it. Number two, the reward of the God-called preacher. Look at verse 16. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel, is what Paul says. What's the reward of preaching the gospel? It's the privilege of preaching that is the reward. It's the privilege of being in God's field of service. It's the privilege of serving in God's vineyard. From Paul's perspective, and in my mind, any man who's been called by God, it is not something that we choose to do. I did not wake up one day and said, I'm going to be a preacher. Believe it or not, I woke up when I was 5 and said, I'm going to be a police officer. Could you imagine that? That'd be awful. I would be a terrible police officer. I'd pull somebody over. They'd say, please don't write me a ticket. I'd be like, all right, that's fine. You go on. God had ordained such a destiny for this Pharisaic, arrogant, and highly educated Jew. God had plans for the life of Paul. And Paul wrote about those briefly in Galatians 1, 15 through 16. This is what he said. But when he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by his grace was pleased to reveal his son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone. He didn't have to ask permission. He didn't have to say, hey, don't I need to go to seminary? He didn't have to do any of those things because he had been called by God. And what a great reminder that is for my life and your life. While his plan for you may not be vocational ministry, it may not be pastoring, but he does have a unique plan for you to do the work of the ministry. And the reward of the God-called preacher is simply getting to follow in his plan. Now, Paul is clear that because God has called him to do this, and that it is not something that he does on his own, he has no room for boasting. Money can often creep in the back door of someone's heart in ministry when they start thinking it's about them. When they start thinking they are the ones saving people, bringing people, etc. Then they want validation for how great they think that they are, and usually they want that validation expressed through money. That is one reason that prosperity preachers even exist. There should not be boasting or pride in our ministries. Boasting and pride will kill your ministry. It should be about the Lord. Because the Lord is the one who's taken a hold of us. He had taken a hold of Paul, and Paul wrote this to the church at Philippi in Philippians 3:12. Not that I have already obtained this or am already perfect, but I press on to make it my own because Christ Jesus has made me his own. Paul then goes on to say in the middle of verse 16, for my necessity is laid upon me. Other translations, such as the CSB, say, I am compelled to preach. Other translations say, I am under compulsion. He cannot do anything other than preach. And when someone feels a call upon their life and that God might be calling them to ministry, the number one thing I say to them is, don't do it. You say, why would you tell them that? Because if I tell them that and they still do it, they have probably been called by God. Here's another thing I tell them that was told to me. If you can do anything else for a job, do it. Because if you're under compulsion and you've truly been called by God, you will preach. And you will pastor his people. The idea is that Paul is under the Lord's compulsion to preach the gospel. He has to preach. If he can't preach, he'd rather die. You know what? I'd agree with that. Some of the best sermons I've ever preached have been to myself. I hadn't shared those with y'all because they're just between me and God. Give you an illustration. Being in the ministry is a reward in and of itself. Being able to stand before you twice a week, open up the Word of God, true honor, true blessing, true privilege. But as my family grows, I didn't say I've arrived. I'm beginning to better understand the toll this great privilege and reward takes on the family of a God called pastor. See, I grew up in it. I'm third generation, 27th overall in my family. It's all I have known. But earlier this week, the Lord allowed me to find something that let me into a little bit of what a pastor's wife goes through. Hannah doesn't know any of this. On Instagram has a feature where you could see where somebody else liked a post. And there's an account for pastors' wives on Instagram, and I saw that Hannah liked this particular post. Here's some things that post said from the perspective of a pastor's wife, because I will tell you, she's not one to complain. She's not one to get upset or anything. But this is what this post that she liked said, and I'm assuming the fact she liked it means she endorsed it, but I don't know. Here's what the post said. You saw preparation. I saw the sleepless nights, the pressure, and the prayers through the tears. You heard a message that carried you through the week. I watched him carry everyone else while quietly falling apart. You shook his hand and told him great sermon. Then he went home to recover from the words someone else had spoken about him. That's one of the hardest things we deal with. When we leave the house Sunday morning, we say, I hope nobody says anything. Because it ruins your whole day. And then I can't sleep. Guess what I had to buy this week? Melatonin. I hadn't had melatonin since I was 8 years old. Some of y'all say your hair is getting darker. Yeah. If I lose it, I'm going to come get you. The post went on to say, you saw the calling, I saw the calling placed on the man that I love. You saw Sunday morning, I saw the other 6 days when ministry didn't stop calling. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you emotional. While it is a reward to the pastor, it's one I enjoy, and I cannot do anything else because God's called me to do it. But I also think, not only is Paul saying, hey, I have to preach, I'm under compulsion. I wonder if he's wanting to tell the Corinthians it's also a reward that you have a pastor. The church should be thankful if they have a pastor. We have a lot of churches in our association right now that are what you call pastorless. We have some churches in our association right now that you might wonder if that person was called by God or if they're just doing a job. I think it's important that if we have a pastor that we realize that that is a reward. Now, I'm not asking for sympathy, no, not at all. But while I, like Paul, am under compulsion to preach, I have realized recently that my family goes through a lot. And I think you need to be reminded every blue moon that we do our best. Are we perfect? No. Do I fail? Yes. But man, do we try. So the only thing I ask is that you not question my heart and my love. I don't do this for anything else other than God, and I try to protect her the best I can, but there are some things inevitable about the glass house. You say, well, why are you getting into all that? I got a daughter coming, and it's hitting me. And Paul says, woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. Now, we need to understand, Paul's not saying that if he were to stop preaching, that he's going to fall over and have a heart attack. All right, that's not what he's saying. But what he is saying is that since he was divinely appointed to preach, he would be under the judgment of God if he didn't preach. So if you're called by God to preach and you don't preach, you're under judgment. Third thing, the responsibility of the God-called preacher. I got you back, girl. I got you back. Verse 17, the responsibility of the God-called preacher. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. Paul continues to speak here in metaphorical language, because of Paul's use of metaphorical language, intends for the word reward to be more understood as pay in connection with verse 16. Paul's point is that he can't boast in preaching the gospel because he didn't do this of his own choosing. He does it because he has to. He has been called by God and therefore has no choice but to preach the gospel. So in his mind, at least for the ministry at Corinth, he does not want to receive a reward or payment. Here in this situation, he's been called by God to preach and pastor this church and has no choice, so he's not going to take compensation. As John MacArthur wrote, he, Paul, had no part in the call himself. God sent Paul to Corinth. I bet once Paul got there, he went, yep, nope, I'm leaving. I've heard stories before. There was a church in the 90s who called a pastor. The pastor got there, spent 4 weeks with them, said, yeah, I'm going back to my old church. And he left. The responsibility of the God-called preacher is not to go where the church is bigger, not to go where the location is better, not to go where the money is larger, the lights are brighter, the music is louder, or where the staff is more numerous. The responsibility of the God-called preacher is to simply go where God calls. That's the responsibility. So often in our world, pastors have lost sight of the responsibility that comes with their calling. I talked about the church a minute ago. Now I'm going to talk about the pastors. Pastors have often had, especially in recent years, had a take my ball and go home approach. We talk about that with church members, but pastors can pout too. I've seen it a few times. Here's what some of them will do. Meaning pastors, if they don't follow me, I'm just going to leave. If things don't go my way, I'll leave. If they don't pay me more, I'll leave. If they don't respect me, I'll leave. If they don't commit to the ministries of the church, I'll leave. Pastoral longevity and tenure are at their lowest points in the history of the Southern Baptist Convention. The average pastor is staying 22 months. Successful, God-called pastoring is not a window shopping experience. God does not call pastors to be window shoppers. God does not call pastors to just find the best church. You don't find the healthiest and best church and then go. You go where God calls. I try to give advice to other preachers all the time if they ask for it, which they don't always do. I still give it, but... Well, is it okay to talk to more than one church at a time? I would say no. If God calls you, you'll know. You don't need to have 3 churches that you're meeting with at the same time and saying, I'm going to pick that one. That's just not how it works. For some guys, that's how it works. That's not how it works, I think, biblically. I think it works biblically is that God calls you because if he called you somewhere and he does want you to move, then he'll call you away from there. He'll release you of that calling and give you a new one. The Apostle Paul clearly reminds us, I say new, continue the calling in a different location. Let me rephrase that. And so the Apostle Paul clearly reminds us with one important word in the second part of verse 17. He says, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. That word stewardship is important when you look at the responsibility of pastors. Stewardship is translated from a Greek word, oikonomon. And this word literally means the management of household affairs, stewardship, and administration. Now, on the flip side of what I just said, some pastors do get frustrated and they leave where God has called them. But sometimes they can get frustrated because it has to do with the church not allowing the pastor to fulfill his God-called responsibility, which is to steward. Some people don't want to be stewarded, right? From personal experience, I can tell you that stewarding God's people is one of the hardest things I've ever done. Stewarding me is hard. Know that. It's hard. And guess what? Stewardship can get hard and messy. And it did between Paul and the Corinthians. It got kind of messy. But it is a necessary part of the calling. If you're a pastor, I do not believe biblically you can have a hands-off philosophy. Oh, well, hopefully they'll just figure it out. They need a shepherd. They need a leader. They need somebody to direct them, but the sheep do need to listen. So when a pastor is stewarding you or a ministry or something in your life, please remember it is a part of our calling. How well, question for you, do you allow somebody to lead and direct you? How well do you respond under authority? How well do you respond when someone is seeking to administer what God has given him to steward? The last and final thing is the result of Paul's pastoral ministry in Corinth. Look at verse 18. Paul says, "What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel." And verse 18, Paul expands on the reward he mentioned in verse 17. Here, Paul alludes to the result of his pastoral ministry in Corinth. The gospel had been thrust upon him. This occurred on the road to Damascus in Acts 9 when Paul gave his life to the Lord. Paul was under compulsion to preach. Why? Because of the Lord's calling on his life, and would have been in trouble with the Lord if he had not preached. Paul was not under compulsion to take payment. He said, "No, I'm not going to do it." And so he made it clear in verses 1 through 14, it's okay for some if they choose. But he keeps talking about a reward. He mentioned it in verse 17. In verse 18, Paul says his reward is preaching the gospel free of charge. But there is more here. Many scholars argue that Paul's referring to an eschatological reward that he's expecting from the Lord. And in 2 Sundays, when we study verses 19 through 27 of this chapter, we will see verses 23 through 27. They specifically focus on eschatology and rewards and things of that nature. But here, Paul is clear that he is preaching the gospel free of charge. So he does not make use of his rights. Some scholars argue that Paul is expecting a reward in heaven for not taking compensation. I don't think that's what Paul has in mind. I don't think that's what he's saying here. What I do think he's saying is that it is more of a privilege to preach the gospel free of charge. It's more of a blessing to be able to do that, because the gift that was given him by the Macedonian churches might have also been sustaining him to be able to minister to the church at Corinth. And so he's thankful and for that blessing, but in a strong way, Paul is giving symbolism to the church at Corinth. This is a powerful illustration that Paul gives. And the result of this is strong. By preaching and pastoring in Corinth free of charge, he's trying to teach them a lesson. That though we have rights, we don't have to take advantage of those rights if they're a stumbling block to others. Paul has the right to be compensated, but he foresees that being a stumbling block with the Corinthians, so he decides not to take it. So if the Corinthians get the memo, they will reconsider their strong defense of eating food from idols in the pagan temples. Paul is practicing what he preached. He's practicing it. He's living it out. The reward that they ought to be pursuing is not getting to eat the food, but the privilege of freely abstaining from it so as not to hinder the gospel. I think one of the main reasons that Paul doesn't exercise his right to be paid is to practice what he was preaching. Let me ask you a question. What's the result of your ministry? Are we cognizant of things that we do that could potentially be a stumbling block for others? How much does our personal reputation hurt or hinder our ministry? This morning's sermon, it's been an interesting one. 2 weeks ago, we looked at money in the ministry and that it's permissible for pastors to be paid. This morning, we looked at the mayhem that can come from it. You might ask a question like I asked the Lord. Why is a sermon like this even worth preaching? Why can't we just tiptoe by it? First off, it's God's Word. All of it is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. End of that verse says, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. Secondly, the more that we are aware of where Satan may try to scheme and attack, the more that we can be prepared. And so this morning we've looked at the reality of some preachers, the reward of the God-called preacher, the responsibility of the God-called preacher, and the result of Paul's pastoral ministry in Corinth. I encourage you, next Sunday we're going to have a guest speaker to kind of end our revival, so to speak. And then 2 Sundays from today, we'll look at verses 19 through 27. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. Lord, even on days when it's tough to preach, Lord, especially texts like this. Lord, I thank you that you are God, and Lord, I thank you you're still good, always good. Lord, this